Hello, my name is Kevin Fuhrmann. I'm a volunteer with Convention of States Action, here to explain what we're about and what's going on in our view about the federal government. So the main thing is there are problems with our federal government that have been exacerbated recently. And the three main areas that we're concerned about are really the debt and spending, federal overreach, and also career politicians. So let me talk briefly about that, just to kind of give you a snapshot of why we're concerned about it. There are a million things we could be concerned about, but this covers a large amount of area that we think we can address with what we're trying to do. So the debt and spending crisis really has gotten way out of control. At the point of when I'm recording this, we've hit the $30 trillion debt mark, which is dangerous. We're really hitting a tipping point, and so I think it's about time we say, let's pull in the reins on that a little bit. So, I think the next thing about that is it's not really a right or left thing. No matter who's in office, they spend way too much of our money. And so, unfortunately, as you can see on the graphic here, it's on an exponential curve, and I don't think it's going to slow down. They're not going to slow down their own power. That's why the states need to step in, and I'll get to the details about that. So that's our big first area. The second area about federal overreach has a lot to do with all the regulations, really. I think it's really crazy to know that pretty much everybody commits a felony every day without even knowing it because of all the way the laws are written and all the rules that are in place over the last number of years, a lot of years. And so what we're trying to do is let's take another look at that, rein that back in, especially from the unelected bureaucrats. So that's a big area of concern. So I want to show you a graphic of the laws that we're being regulated under. This first one is the laws that were passed by Congress. So this is just a pile of those laws that have been passed by Congress. And then there's the second one, which is a big list of all the rules and laws that have been enacted by the unelected bureaucrats, or the deep state as people like to call them, that are ruling our lives. And so that's a really good graphic to understand it's way out of control, and we need to take a hard look at what we've allowed to happen over the years. So there's that. Now, there's a big question that comes up often in this conversation is, well, what about following the Constitution? Now, I'm going to play another short video with Michael Ferris talking. He's one of the co-founders of Convention of States. So I'll let him talk to that directly.
People like us, people that are frustrated with Washington, D.C., often say, well, they don't follow the Constitution anyway. Not true. They follow the wrong one. They're following the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court rather than the Constitution as written.
This, taking out of my pocket, is a pocket Constitution. 4,000 words in the original document, 4,400 words. If you count the amendments, we're talking about 7,000 words. But here is the Constitution in force today. This is 3,000 pages of Supreme Court rulings showing what every ruling has done to the original words. This isn't going to get any smaller. In fact, every time they publish this document, they leave a bunch of blank pages at the back for additional rulings that they know are coming. Every page in this document means a grant of power to the federal government. Understand that this is the Constitution in operation today, and unless we change it, unless we make its wording crystal clear, we're going to continue to operate under this document forever and ever until the whole house of cards comes falling down.
So yeah, another great visual on just the overreach of our government. And for me, I'd have to say I'm just as guilty of not stepping in, because the problem seems so large for a lot of people. They tend to, and I'll just, for me for sure, say, well, I'm just one person. I can't do anything about it. Well, luckily, we have something in our Constitution that allows us to check that. But first, let's talk about that third area. So career politicians, it's really not hard to understand that a lot of people have made a career out of being a politician. I know the founding fathers would have found that rather distasteful because they saw it as a duty, not as something to aspire to. And so that we've allowed our system become so powerful and full of money that people want to make a career out of it, I think just speaks to a small part of the problem. And as another graphic, people are staying in office longer and longer and longer, and they get elected almost automatically because of all the money that is involved in the whole process. So we've got to address that head on, I believe. So that's the problem, let's say. But let's talk about a solution, right? So again, we could talk for hours about the problems, but those are the three areas we're very concerned about and want to address using the Constitution. I'll get into details about what I mean by that in a moment. But first, let's talk about this. What did the Founding Fathers say? So, yet another video. Let's look at
The 15th of September, 2 days before they signed the document, the end of 4 long, hot months in Philadelphia. They were ready to go home. But George Mason noticed that Article 5 only had a single method for amending the Constitution. He said, wait a minute, what if Congress becomes an obstacle?
It was given to us by George Mason, who said, look at guys, someday this government's going to abuse its power, and there won't be anything for you ever to ratify if it's counting on Congress to reduce the power of the federal government. So we need to give the states the ability to reduce the power of the federal government.
All right, so again, thanks to George Mason, who had the foresight to stand up near the end and say, wait a minute, we're counting on Congress to be the stopgap, and we know by the nature of governments that they're not going to do that eventually. They're going to become too tyrannical, too big, too bloated, all that. And I personally believe that's where we are, and so the Founding Fathers would for sure stand up and say that this is enough. The other thing about that goes by pretty quick is that was a unanimously yes vote, and it was even without debate. And if you read any of the James Madison notes about that convention, they debated everything, like word placement, all kinds of things. So to have something come up without debate and unanimously vote yes, that speaks volumes about how important they thought this was and why they felt it was very important to put this clause in. We're going to talk about that. So, speaking of Article 5, which has been brought up, I do want to read to you that verbiage. I think it's important to hear it. So forgive me, but I'm going to read it because we usually don't learn this. I did not learn this in school when I was in school a very long time ago now. And in working with high school students over the last number of years, I know they're not learning it either, that I can tell. So it's worth reading. So it says, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid in all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. So that's what the text says in Article 5. And I think it's really important to understand we have two methods of doing that. So our plan really is to use Article 5. So first is we're going to use that from a grassroots effort. But let me get into how it works, because that's where people get a little confused or don't know. So this is a chance for us to know, like, well, how does that actually happen? So there are actually two ways to, in that Article 5, there are two clauses. There's kind of two paths for an amendment to happen. And the first one is the way that we've had all 27 of our amendments happen so far have gone this first path. And that is Congress sits down and they debate ideas for an amendment, and if 2/3 of them say, yes, we think this is a good idea, then that goes to the states for ratification. So just them debating it and voting yes doesn't make that an amendment. It goes to the states. 3/4 of the states have to say yes for it to become an amendment. Again, that's how all 27 of our amendments to our Constitution have happened so far. There have been a lot more attempts, but those are the only ones that have made it, and that's the only method. The second clause of what I just read in Article 5 is the other path. So there's another way to do that, where the states call for a convention. If 2/3 of the states, or 34, call for a convention of states to propose amendments, then it's called and they meet. And in that, I'll talk a little bit more detail, but they send delegates, propose amendments, debate, and then they'll have a vote. Each state will get one vote. So if a simple majority of 26 or more states say, yes, we think this is a good idea, then again, it goes to the states for ratification with that 3/4 of the states bar that has to be met to make it an amendment. That hasn't happened yet in that way, but that's what we're calling for. We're calling to use that second clause in our Constitution to amend the Constitution. All right, so in detail, let's walk through those pieces just to make sure. First, we want the people to lead. We're building a grassroots army, if you will. It's pressuring our legislatures to pass resolutions to call for this convention. We can see that the federal government's not going to rein itself in. We need to use that clause to rein them in and clarify what the Constitution actually does say and what it doesn't say. So those are the kinds of things that we can debate. I'll get to the specifics on what would be debated at that convention in a little bit. So then the state legislatures act. So if it passes both houses, if they have two, most do, there's one that doesn't. But if it passes both houses, then it becomes a passed state for the call for the convention. Okay? Then if 34 states pass that resolution, then the convention is called. And so then the date is set and meeting and all that. All the states send delegates. They can send as many delegates as they like. The state gives the delegates a purview. Here's what you're going to vote on. Here's what you're not going to let pass. Here's et cetera, et cetera. They give them direction. And if they don't follow that direction, they can be recalled by the state. But each state only gets one vote when it comes down to a vote. So they can send 100 delegates, they can send one delegate, but each state only gets one vote when it comes down to the voting process. If 26 or more say yes to any proposed amendment that's made in the convention, then that goes to the states for ratification. And again, 3/4 or 38 of the 50 have to vote yes to make that an amendment. If that happens, that proposed amendment does become a real amendment as part of our Constitution. So that's the process of that second clause, just to make it a little clearer how that works. So I think it's good to step through the process because a lot of people really don't know much about it. I certainly did not know a lot about Article 5 before finding out about Convention of States action. And in doing research, I realized, wow, okay, this actually could make a difference, which is why I'm standing here today. I think it can. I think it has the tools to rein in the federal government on a large level, is what we need at this point. So our strategy is build that grassroots. Okay. Also, we want to pass that resolution. So here's what the resolution looks like. One of the procedural things is all the resolutions have to be worded the same. So you can't have one state asking for 2 things and another one asking for 3 other things. That's not how it works. So everybody has to have the same agenda, agree on the agenda, and then the convention is called. Now there's another thing I want to read to you, and I want to talk about so the legislature, like section 1, what we're asking for is this, right? So the legislature of the state of whichever state hereby applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of a convention of the states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. And what's interesting about that wording for me recently was for its officials applies to the unelected bureaucrats as well. If you have term limits on just the elected officials, in a way that actually emboldens the unelected bureaucrats to have more power, because they just stay and they can do whatever they want, whoever's in office, doesn't matter. But if all of them have limits, Now we've got some teeth in it, and term limits makes some sense. So let's move on from there. So that's how the process works. But I do want to talk about common objections that have and do come up often. And there's 5 main ones that I've heard and or read about or seen that I'd like to walk through right now. The first one is the one you're going to hear the most, and Article 5 is a constitutional convention or a con-con. So if you hear somebody say that, one thing is this: the Article 5 provisions that have happened in our history. There's constitutional convention, there's an amending convention, there's also non-amending conventions. So in our history, there have been many multiples of conventions of states way back when, even before the Articles of Confederation. That's how they figured out how to deal with each other. So it's not this weird mystical thing, it's just one way to have a convention of states is a constitutional convention. That's not what we're doing. We're asking for an amending convention. So the distinction, I think, gets blurred a little bit because of some of the propaganda, if you will, that was put out in the 70s by some people that didn't do their research and said that Article 5 would be a constitutional convention, just like the, quote, runaway convention of 1787, which on both fronts is actually inaccurate and non-factual. So be careful with that. Usually people will say, and you'll even see it written, Article 5 Constitutional Convention. Those are 2 entirely different things. So anybody that's saying that doesn't know what they're talking about, and they're misleading people at best, lying at worst. So it really holds no weight, and when that starts to come up, I pretty much cut it off at the pass and move on, because they really don't know what they're saying. All right, the second one is we have no idea how it would operate. So here's the thing about that. In our history, we've had over 650 conventions of states, and all of them followed the same protocol. They all had an agenda they agreed on. They all had one state, one vote. They all voted on that and either got a provision or an agreement, or they didn't, and then they disbanded. Every single one followed that track. None of them went off the rails. None of them did anything outside. And speaking of that 1787 Philadelphia Convention, the mistake that people have is this: the states authorized the delegates to go and take care of the problem of the Articles of Confederation. Later, the Congress of the Articles of Confederation put their kind of rubber stamp on it. And so that's what people point to say that they didn't have the authority. But the authority to write the Constitution we have now came from the states, not from Congress. So that's where people are confused / don't understand. I would highly recommend that you read Dr. Robert Nadelson's book, The Law of Article 5. He does a great job of laying this out. It's lawyerly, but it's worth a read and getting through, so you really understand the history and the context of how that happened and why that was not a runaway convention. Even though you'll hear that stated, it's not. So do your own research. Don't believe me. Do your own research. In fact, you can go to our website, conventionofstates.com/resources, and find all kinds of materials to explain what I'm talking about in much more detail than I can get into. Worth your time. All right, let's move on. Myth number 3 is that the topic of an Article 5 convention can't be limited, so therefore we could rewrite the Constitution, we could rescind the other amendment, whatever. Crazy things that people say. And again, it comes from this misunderstanding of what a convention of states is. Partly, I think, is we've never done one, and we've not even done a non-amending convention of states for quite some time in the public eye. So it just seems, again, like this mysterious thing that has happened in the past that we don't understand. We actually legally and historically do understand it, just like I mentioned, 650 times. It followed the rules. It did the same thing. So we have a lot of precedent. So this statement really has no basis in any fact. It's just fear-mongering. In fact, a lot of these myths are purported by people that are trying to keep people fearful from taking action so they can keep their power. So keep that in mind when you hear people say, this is a bad idea. Where's it coming from? Why? What's their motivation in saying it? So just be careful. Usually, almost always that I've found, it's usually keeping people in fear to not take action so that they don't lose their power. And we want to do that. We want to get the states to have the power they're supposed to have. Okay, the last one, or actually, no, number 4, sorry. Congress would control an Article 5 convention. And again, if you were to read James Madison notes on how they looked at the federal government, they were very concerned that it would become tyrannical and would turn into what they just fought a war over. So they didn't want that. So they were very concerned about the federal government having checks and balances, not being able to move forward very quickly and grow too big. So there's no way they were going to allow two clauses to have Congress the same power. It just wouldn't go into their mindset. Anything you read about the Federalist Papers, that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So on that sense alone, this really doesn't fly. The other thing is, in one federal court, they've actually said that Congress can't use Article 1 powers, what is that? The necessary and proper clause, right? So even under that clause, they can't affect an Article 5 convention. The last one, myth number 5, is that the convention is going to be railroaded by, like rogue delegates. They're going to be able to do whatever they want, and big money is going to buy them all off and all that. Okay, so my first answer to that is it's not really it's more of a quip. But I think it's worth saying is, okay, if you're concerned about big money buying people off, well, if we don't do anything, that's already happening. That's already going on. So if you're concerned about big money buying things off, and that's why not to take this action, you're going to get it anyway. Now, the problem with that idea is you've got enough people right now that have signed on to this idea that are interested in saving the country. They're not interested in your money. Now, can people be bought off? Of course they can. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be that way for every single person. So it'll be very, very difficult. Not only that, all the safeguards in place would keep it in check, right? So the bar to just get the resolution passed to call for a convention is 2/3 of the states. Okay? And we're going to talk about where we're at right now, but that's a big, big bar in and of itself. Again, it's not really happened before. And then also, you've got the proposed amendments have to be voted on. The majority of the states have to agree. Then 3/4 of the states, right, have to make it an amendment. So 13 states, it only takes 13 to not let an amendment pass. So if you think of the worst case scenario of something that would come out of a, quote, runaway convention or whatever, to get back to the states, okay, whatever the worst case is, I'm sure you can think of at least 13 states that would say no way to that right now. So the bar is way too high. The safeguards are very large. I'm certainly confident that's going to happen safely. All right, so now, again, the strategy overall is build the grassroots. That's the main thing. And then also we want to have people... So on that, let me just back up a second. So on the grassroots, over 5 million people have signed the petition and are on board with this. We have action in all 50 states. And so we're looking to just keep moving until so we can get that second clause to be a reality. So what we're trying to do is this, all right? We're trying to get that to happen, and our progress is 19 states have passed the resolution. So they are passed states. They are called for the Convention of States, Article 5, amending convention. And there's action in other states and all that. So we're over the halfway mark. 4 of those states happened last year as of this recording. So there's a lot of momentum to it. Also, we did some surveying of states that haven't passed yet, and a high majority of all who were surveyed, and that's all political stripes, said once they understood what we were talking about, we sat down and explained this, they said that's a great idea because the federal government is too big. So, half the country doesn't like when the other side's in power, so it doesn't, somebody's upset, right? So the federal government really is just too big. We need the states to be in control of their own destiny as it was supposed to be set up originally. Other things to consider, I guess, are people who have endorsed this. They tend to be right-thinking, right-leaning people because right-leaning people tend to think of less government. But again, I really don't think of this as a right-left issue. I think of it more as an up-down issue. This is a states versus federal, not a right-left. The more we get involved with the right-left thing, the more we can be distracted from how big the federal government is and how much they have overreached into our lives. So these are some of the people that endorse it. You can certainly check things out on our website. Again, go to conventionofstates.com/endorsements, Here's the legal board of directors, if you will. These are the people of high legal constitutional lawyer minds that are saying, here's the right way to do this, here's what not to do, here's the things that need to be put in place, here's how you want to go about it so that the safeguards are all in place. So again, if you want to see the whole list, you want to research those people, which I invite you and kind of implore you to do, please go to conventionestates.com/endorsements. Okay, so what now? Here's what we want to do. Sign the petition. So if this sounds good, or if you want to find out more, go to conventionestates.com, do a little bit more research, sign the petition, and that will get to your legislator to let them know that you want them to make this happen. And I'll put pressure on them and to know that if enough of their constituents are in, if they don't do it, they're out of a job, we'll find somebody that will do it. That's kind of the pressure we're putting on that end. Another thing you can do really is that you can volunteer, and you can also contribute if you'd like. So the main thing is sign the petition. Really, that's the big thing. Just as I'm in. Then, if you want to help things move forward, volunteer. There's lots of things you can do from a volunteering standpoint. You can block walk, right? Go door knocking. You can call people, email people, text people. We've got things set up. We've got an infrastructure set up to make that easy. We can reach a lot of people and have some sway in this movement of getting the federal government to pull back. So that's what I have for you. I hope that was informative. If you have any questions, please go to conventionestates.com, check out resources, ask questions there if you'd like, and I hope to see you someday. Good luck out there. We've got a country to save, so let's get busy.